Welcome to another episode of the Engage Parish Podcast. Today we will be joined by Mark Matthews. Before I introduce Mark, I'd like to remind our listeners that we are available on Apple Podcast and Spotify, as well as YouTube and other places where you consume podcasts. Please be sure to give us a 5-star rating, like and subscribe. It helps us tremendously. So thank you very much for your support. Mark Matthews is a visual effects and AI expert, having worked 10 years at DreamWorks Animation. He holds 22 feature film credits, including Kung Fu Panda, Shrek Forever After, and Madagascar II. His algorithms give more fire to explosions, fluff to hair, and jiggle to bellies. He received 2 DreamWorks Technical Achievement Awards for his volume rendering and hair modeling systems, and has been awarded multiple patents for AI algorithms. Mark regularly speaks and writes on entertainment culture, AI, male identity, and surviving as a creative in Hollywood. Since 2012, he has been the Hollywood Undercover Missionary, a monthly segment on Salt and Light Radio, airing nationally on Sirius XM, including during the Salt and Light Hour. He has also appeared on EWTN Radio and Mary's Touch Radio. He is the founder of Bibles and Brew, a Catholic men's fellowship group that encourages men to grow in their faith and masculine identity. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm born and raised on the Canadian prairies. Grew up as a geek. I love taking things apart, playing with Lego and stuff like that. Make a long story short, I kind of fell in love with computer graphics at a very early age, which eventually led me to get like a master's in computer graphics, and eventually led to me getting a job in research and development at DreamWorks Animation, which brought me to Hollywood, which kind of got me thinking a lot more about entertainment culture and just kind of where the field is going. And then also, being a Catholic myself too, and, taking my faith pretty seriously, asking like, well, what's the intersection here? How do these things, combine? What's the role of faith and entertainment and media and everything? So it's a topic I just love talking about and thinking about.
And I'm extremely excited for our conversation today. We're not only going to talk about Bibles and Brew, a men's fellowship group that you've started in Hollywood, but also we're going to get into tech and AI. So
Sure.
Buckle up. We're going to have a great conversation today. And maybe we can start there with Bibles and Brew. Can you tell us a little bit more about that men's program and how your experience in Hollywood influenced that?
Yeah, sure. So it's what I like to call a micro ministry. It's nothing big. It's something I just run out of my living room. But I think that's kind of a nice, easy format because it's then, hey, something anyone can copy. And we would just meet in my living room every other week and take some time to read through some kind of a book together, either focused on just like basics of the faith, catechesis, what does it mean to have, a relationship with Christ in the context of being a Catholic, but then also say perhaps more masculine issues, things like leadership, initiative, purity, things like that. And it kind of grew out of, I had some experience with an organization called Catholic Christian Outreach, which is very analogous to Focus, which I'm sure you've probably heard of, which is the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. And basically through that, CCO was very formative in my own faith. And I also learned kind of how to like run a faith study group and just how to run a successful event. And so I just took a lot of those techniques when I came here and just applied them. And I met a lot of people, say, who would have been raised as like a good Catholic, but maybe didn't have the best catechesis and were kind of hungering for something more, a little bit deeper. So this was just, I don't know, just, hey, let's just bring people together and try and grow in our faith in some way, shape, or form. So
could you describe some of the activities and programs that you guys do in Bibles and Brew, and how has that led to more Catholic camaraderie among the men that you meet with?
Mm-hmm. So again, very simple. It's like what I call a micro ministry. Is it just simply meeting for basically 2 hours every 2 weeks. And one of my key things was like, I want to do this consistently. And so when I first moved here to Hollywood, this is understandable, but a lot of people come here with like, we want to do big things. We want to do big things for God. We're going to do this ministry. And then a year later it would have just kind of like fizzled out and, nothing kind of happened. And so I just felt like, let's just do something small and let's just do it consistently. And so I think that's sometimes a little bit more God's way. And it's even a little bit, I don't know, like what I find in Hollywood, and honestly, probably this is everywhere in the world, is that it's a little bit of ego piggybacking on faith. It's people saying, "Oh, we want to do big things for God." It's kind of like, no, you want to do big things for yourself. And so I was sort of, and I've also been influenced very much by the spirituality of Catherine Doherty, which very much focuses on kind of like poverty and hiddenness. And so like I was just like, let's just do something small and simple. So basically, it was just running our meetings regularly. Very simple format. And then occasionally we would sometimes have like some special events. We'd sometimes bring in like a speaker, if we had a connection of someone who'd be a good speaker, or we'd run an event, like an annual event called like Ladies Night, or we would invite women and honor them and, serve them a meal kind of a thing. But otherwise, honestly, it's a pretty simple format. So not much to it.
And it seems like there is somewhat of a crisis of male identity going on. And this topic has been talked about quite extensively, I'd say, over the last half decade, maybe even more. And Catholics are paying attention. Could you tell us what you sort of see? Especially, it seems to me like Hollywood might be a microcosm of that in a pretty intense way.
Certainly, yeah. I think like one of the, like I always say, like Hollywood is a great mission field, and it is like it's its own culture. It has its own way of speaking and talking. People don't think of it as a mission field, but it's hugely important, and it's also very influential because the culture here ends up transmitting to the rest of the world. It's a great question. What does it mean even to have a masculine identity? I think for me, one of the key things of masculine identity is incarnation. And so it's this idea that Jesus Christ picked a particular time, place, and person to reveal himself in. And so the simplest way this can be manifest with us is a lot of times people will have like oh man, wouldn't it be great if we did this or did that? They have a feeling, they want to do something, but do they actually ever make it happen? And this is, again, just because we're going to make everything about LA and Hollywood life. Hollywood is kind of like, oh yeah, man, that'd be great. We should do that, or yeah, this is going to be a big project. And, people will talk a lot about their projects, but oftentimes they won't kind of like materialize into something. And so one of my things was like, just, hey, pick a time, place, location, people, and make things happen. Just kind of like get stuff done, incarnate, make that thing real. And so that is, there's a lot of aspects to masculinity. But incarnation, I think, is one that I think is particularly important. And with that kind of like very closely also is this idea of initiative, of kind of like seeing a need, and then doing that thing, basically, and acting out of love. You're creating these things, you're incarnating, not for your own needs or desires, but for the needs of what you see in the community of the people around you. So yeah, those two things I think kind of go, very, very, very closely hand in hand.
Could you talk about the community aspect? Because, we just talked about how the church seems to be, or people in the church seem to be kind of spearheading this idea of Catholic identity, but it always seems like it's tough to get men together. Men don't want to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, at least most of the men I know. So could you talk about that, and also the importance of community with Bibles and Brew, or really any similar men's group that forms?
Yeah, we don't hold hands. We don't sing Kumbaya. So I think, that's one thing very much to be aware of, is just like, don't do some of these kind of non-masculine things that we see in the church sometimes. Community is so incredibly important. I think men have kind of a natural tendency to just kind of like want to go into our cave and just be comfortable there. I think one of the wonderful things about what I would call like men's ministry is like you just bring men together and generally good things happen. I think with Bibles and Brew, we do, when we're having our discussion, I do try to set a tone of like, hey, let's talk about open up, dare I say the word intimacy, talk about things that are important to us. And that kind of sets the tone. But then it opens up and guys are like, hey, yeah, I totally want to talk about this. So it's, it's the irony is that being in a big city like Los Angeles, you can have this incredibly high population density, and yet you've got people who are so incredibly lonely. And so community, there's just so many great things that come from it. And all you got to do is just incarnate it, just make it happen, just tell people where it's going to be. Another kind of like key thing about that, and something that I learned from CCO, is make it a personal invitation. Like it helps a lot to talk to people specifically and say, hey, Jim, I'm having this event, you should really come to it. And that's kind of an act of love, of reaching out to people. So
yeah, and I know that there really seems to be this springing up of lots of even well-known programs for men. There's That Man Is You. Exodus 90 seems to be very popular these days. I know quite a few folks
doing it
here.
right now. So,
oh yeah, yes,
or trying to do it right now, I should say.
Same on my end, failing frequently, but trying. And actually, we're scheduling Jamie Baxter to come on the podcast. He is, I believe, awesome. The founder and currently runs Exodus 90. So we'll get into that a little bit more with him.
Just make sure he knows that a Canadian cold shower is a very different experience than an American cold shower. Just the average cold temperature there is a lot lower. So Canadian men are a little bit holier, just so you know. So
that is an excellent point. I always think of that as well. It's, if you live in the southern states, if you're down in Florida, you're not having a true cold shower. That water's pretty warm.
It's true. It's true.
I'll remind Jamie of that when we have him on the the podcast.
Yeah.
Could you hinted at this, but could you talk about what healthy masculinity looks like, and maybe also, I don't know if you thought about this, but some of the pitfalls that could lead towards toxic masculinity?
It's a great question. It's cliche, but the quote from Spider-Man comes to mind: with great responsibility with great power, it comes great responsibility. And so I think as soon as you take on these things of what I'm going to call incarnation in general, of making things happen, and I've noticed this in my own my own experience, is it's sort of a form of power. You're making things happen, you're changing the world, and then all of a sudden there's kind of like a little bit of a battle that happens there, and you have to make sure that your intentions are truly for others and not for yourself. And the interesting thing kind of in the battle there sometimes is that you can have the intention for others, but people will accuse you of acting for yourself. And so this is sort of where it takes on a bit of, I'd say, a little bit of a spiritual battle element to it. The answer to that, or the solution, is just classic Catholic asceticism. Is just, what does it mean to love? Learn everything you can about that. Have a spiritual director, take on prayer, read the scriptures, ask God, what do people around me need? And so I think when people talk about toxic masculinity, it's basically, I would say, this, initiative or power, but directed towards self, not directed towards others. And so I think sometimes the incorrect response to that is like, oh, we're just going to relinquish power just because, power always leads to something bad, not good. And that is not the right answer. That's just kind of sitting back and being passive. And as Catholics, we're supposed to say, like, no, we can have this quote unquote power. We are called to act in the world, but we're called to act in a way that loves others. So I guess, does that make sense? Should we try and make it a little bit more concrete, or?
No, that does make sense. And you're absolutely right. I think when that power becomes self-serving or just about image or something like that, that's, I think, when the toxicity can start to creep in. Just like anything in life, it seems like prudence and having things be well measured are the way to go. And of course, prayer and reflection to make sure your intentions are in the right spot. I think you hit the nail on the head with sort of what the difference is. It's easy to slip into, but that doesn't mean that we don't chase trying to be masculine.
And I think you have to risk it. It's just a risk that's going to
Good
come
point.
if you're like, hey, I want to be an initiator. I want to make things happen in the world. It's like I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but it's like have the humility to learn from those and move on. So
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think another crisis, we talked about male masculinity, and hopefully we'll see a turn here, especially in the church as, these programs just become more and more popular. But also, particularly for men, but really for everyone, with technology, with us just being, I'm guilty of this, obsessed with our phones sometimes and just so drawn in, it's
yep,
easy to lose, and just all the conveniences we have, it's
yep,
easy to lose that sense of purpose and fulfillment.
yep.
I think men can especially be affected by that. Could you talk about that and maybe how Bibles and Brew have helped you, and also the men that are in the program or in your meeting, find that purpose and community
Yeah.
once again, like we talked about earlier?
Okay. Again, great question. I don't know if we have the answer on it. I think part of the problem is that like this, what I'm going to call the media landscape. And so when I say media, I don't just mean like traditional film and television. I basically mean anything that draws our eyeballs. So like this device kind of in front of us. And so we're developing all these fantastic new ways of distracting ourselves. And so one of the things that we would talk about, of course, in Bibles and Brew is purity. And so, things like porn, are a huge endemic problem. And often it's, again, this is kind of one of the great things I love about, men's ministries. It's sort of, it's so simple. What's the solution? Just talk about it, open up about it, and all of a sudden, like what you're doing when you're opening up is you are shining a light in the darkness. Satan loves the darkness, God loves being in the light. And so just by sharing it with others, you're bringing it to the light. And that in and of itself is incredibly healing. What we are just starting to see and recognize now is, say, like all these lesser things. Like there's lots of great YouTube channels I'm loving, like, the hydraulic press channel. Let's, just crush something in a hydraulic press and see what happens to it. It's inane, but for some reason I love watching it, but I love watching it too much. And so again, this is, I think part of the answer here is like, we need to talk about it. And so things like Exodus 90, like this is one of the reasons I did it this year, is I found I'm like, oh, I'm just being distracted too much. And so when you look at the world at large, and I hear this from a lot of people in ministry, it's basically, it's like we're just being distracted from asking ourselves the big questions. What is the meaning of life? Why do I exist? Why am I here? It's like, well, no, let me just watch this next hydraulic press channel video, so I don't know what the answers are yet. And what's interesting is you see kind of this rebellion against it. So I would say even something like the hipster movement, like people who like using 8-track players and vinyl records, is like a bit of an interior unconscious rebellion against this, of like, oh, I'm being distracted so efficiently. But yet I know I'm losing something of myself. So this is kind of where I say, like, we're called to be saints. Is how would a saint use Facebook? Like, we don't know. Hopefully that will be you or I or any of our listeners, will, write the book and they'll be like, oh, that was Saint, I don't know, Jim. He taught us how to use Facebook, somehow. So
Yeah, that is interesting to think about. And you're right. I think we're all figuring this out. We're in this monumental moment when it comes to technology, and it's everywhere, as you mentioned. And even to your point, those outside the Christianity have seen what technology can do in terms of playing with our psychology to suck us in and wasting that time. So I do agree with you. I think we're seeing rumblings of a bit of a tech revolt, if you even want to go that far and call it that.
Yeah.
And they're just like everything. There's probably a bit of a pendulum swing that'll happen until hopefully one day we find that happy medium.
Yep.
And I think that topic is perfect to jump into ways that the church can leverage emerging tech, because I know this is a big area of your expertise and things that you're working on right now. How can the church leverage emerging tech in ways that are useful?
Great question, and like you said, yeah, one of the areas I love talking about. Um, So, okay, before I give any say specific prescriptions, I think maybe it's helpful sometimes to put it into perspective. And what helps us a lot thinking about, say, new technologies, thinking about how previous technologies were used or adopted. And so, I might even give electricity as an example. And what's interesting too is that, so we were just talking about this rebellion against kind of new technologies, is historically people were kind of scared of electricity at some point. They were like, oh, what if it jumps out of the walls, and kills me, kind of a thing. And so we kind of didn't sort of fully understand it. And I'm sure some people, 150, 200 years ago were saying, well, how can we use electricity in the church? And honestly, they probably didn't know. They probably didn't have a clue. And maybe the biggest things that came out of that were electrical lighting and amplification systems. And it's funny because I've toured a lot of old churches recently, and they have these sort of, I don't know exactly what they're called, but they're sort of almost like a pulpit that's lifted up and in the middle of the congregation. And if you think about it, before they had amplified speakers, they didn't know that they had to do that for practicality, but you never see them used anymore because they have amplified sound, and we don't have the kind of I don't know, the ambiance of candles everywhere anymore because we have, electric illumination. So kind of maybe my thing there, um, is we typically have no idea how a newly invented technology is going to be used in the end. People probably had all sorts of different ideas. It's also a little bit akin to asking, my apologies, this is a little bit of a rambling, but hopefully
This
we'll
is
see
good.
some of the
Yes.
we'll see some of the connections. Is so people here in Hollywood want to make Christian films. And so it's kind of this question of well, what does it mean to make a Christian film? And so you could also pose the question well, we want to make a Christian car or a Catholic car. It's well, what does that mean? Should we have a confessional in the back seat, maybe a pop-up that baptismal font in the trunk or something like that? Or maybe a Catholic car is just a good car. And sometimes I think, unfortunately, when it comes to Christian filmmaking, is we take that baptismal font approach or confessional. We just kind of hammer something in that really is sort of not congruent with the nature of what it is. And so film is sort of not meant necessarily to be propaganda, and yet that's kind of quite often what Christians end up doing when we try to make a Christian film. And so I would say, well, no, a good film is just a good, entertaining story, and it's going to be built on Christian values, the same way that a Christian car is just a good car, built on, say, potentially, Christian values. And then all the ways that, how can a car influence the faith? Well, I don't know. That's an interesting question. It's going to it's going to change the dynamics of community for sure. It's going to bring people in from further places. It's going to make new populations reachable. You think about mission fields off in Africa or something like that. That kind of changes things. So but that's kind of subtle. Those are very subtle, different things in what we might naively think how we're going to use a technology. My last example is, this is going to date myself, but when I was in university, color inkjet printers were just coming out. And so one of my classmates got one, and he handed in his lab report, and the heading was in pink, the next body of text was in green, the graphs were all in blue, and it was all this bright color. And kind of, it's whoa, look at this, it's all color. But in the end, it's well, what happened, in the next year or two? Well, everyone just went to using black and white for the text, kind of like we should. And so I think what happens quite often is we have this fascination with these new whiz-bang technologies, and it takes a long time until we figure out how they really should be used. And bringing it back to the church, I think a great example of this is projection screens. I don't know how you feel about these screens some churches will have. I think I've seen them used very well. In some places, I've mostly seen them used very poorly. And quite often, it's just something that's distracting or doesn't need to be there. and I don't know if it's like every word of every, prayer that's said, well, that's probably a little bit overboard, or if the art, like you have to realize, like, our architecture of our modern churches were built to draw the eye into meditation. And so you kind of have this other thing here that is sort of distracting people away from it. And so we're really discovering how to use these technologies. Does that mean we shouldn't be trying to use them? I don't think so. I think we should be trying some of these kind of like crazy, stupid things, but we also should be pretty ready to admit our mistakes, and kind of go, yeah, maybe we don't need multicolored fonts on those screens every time for every, song we're singing or something like that. So anyway, that's kind of my long rambling answer to just technology in general with church. I think basically it's like, how do you use a new technology? It's like, we don't know. It tends to be very complicated, but you have to try things and you have to be willing to change quite a bit.
Yeah, no, you brought up some excellent points. I even think of the parish where my wife and I go to as things were opening up after COVID, and they were live streaming the mass because there was spacing requirements and all these things going on. They were streaming mass into the parish hall and some other areas, and using that technology so that more people could physically be there in the church location and receive our Lord in the Eucharist. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's all about how these are applied, and we can get overexcited when something new, or even scared when something new enters our purview. And I think obviously the most emerging technology right now is AI. And let me just ask you right now: should we be afraid of AI?
I don't think so. I think it's going to follow a lot of the same patterns that we saw with any other kind of new technology. I think, so one of the common fears is it's going to take away all of our jobs. And so if you look at history, well, when they invented the combine, the people who were threshing by hand kind of said, hey, you're taking away our dignity. Like, this is something we do, and 100 years later, well, who threshes by hand anymore? Well, nobody does. Everybody's using the machine. Now, the point they made is it's kind of true. We did lose some form of like dignity or some kind of contact with the earth. And so it's kind of maybe not surprising that, you see religious orders who will, harvest things by hand kind of for these reasons. And there's kind of even these sort of like very earthy movements of people who want to live in, close to the land. So it's maybe kind of like two realizations there is like, one, we are losing something. So, be aware of that as we, kind of use it to automate these things for us. But then also like, that sounds horrible, but like resistance is futile. Like if it makes things easier, like people are just going to end up using it and society is going to change. So like, I think there's some very unfounded fears about AI taking over the world. And I'm kind of like, well, it's always going to remain in our control. It makes a great sci-fi movie plot. But I don't think it's realistic at all in any way, shape or form. So, I'll always say like, yeah, it's going to remain in our control. One of my friends likes to point out, well, hey, Mark, how about electricity? Like, do we really control electricity or does it control us? Like, can you imagine living without electricity? And it's kind of like, ooh, yeah, that's a good point. Like, none of us could live without electricity. And so that is kind of the more subtle kind of thinking that we need to be doing about these kinds of, about new technologies in general. So when I think it comes to, things like AI, I don't think it's going to be that it's going to, take over the world or anything like that. I think maybe one of like my bigger fears, not a fear really, but maybe bigger concerns is what I would almost call like kind of like substitute socialization. And you don't even need to look to AI for this. Like, honestly, the invention of the sitcom TV show is sort of a form of substitute socialization. You can have a relationship with fictional characters on TV, and you can even go to your friends the next day. Hey, did you see what Kramer did last night? Oh, isn't that hilarious? As though you were relating to other real people in real life. And so I think AI will only offer the possibilities to supercharge these kinds of effects. Like, what if, you know, you had a TV show that was tailored to you or something like that? So, you know, those are the things probably that would, you know, concern me more, say, maybe from like a human ethical perspective, just sort of amplifying that loneliness. It's kind of like, you know, saccharine socialization. It has the appearances of socialization, but not actually fulfilling that sort of true need for socialization. Yeah, and I think too, maybe just anything to do with kind of like automation in general. We should always be aware of, like, yeah, we did lose something when we stopped harvesting by hand. There was something kind of beautiful about that. And so just to kind of like be aware, like, hey, maybe there are times when I should be, you know, writing and doing my own thinking instead of, you know, getting a machine to do it for me. So.
And it's interesting how, as you pointed out, just like the pendulum we were talking about earlier, these things tend to come back into use to some extent, and they almost become like these cottage industries of handmade whatever, hand cut whatever. So it is interesting. People sort of return to those as almost an art form later on, as we really you know, leverage the technology to its fullest. And the church has already inserted herself into the conversation around AI, which I think is a good thing. I mean, the church has guidance on really anything that we can take and for our benefit. But as things continue to be shaped, I do think that we'll see some guidance and guidelines from the church in the right use of these things, and also, as you're sort of alluding to, some of the pitfalls of it. Just in terms of the practical uses of AI, you know, we have a lot of parishes that obviously listen to this podcast. What do you see are some of the strong benefits of AI, and how could a parish practically use it to, you know, its advantage, whether it's gaining efficiency or, what are your thoughts there?
That's a really tough question. I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I think it might be, I mean, I guess maybe I would kind of say we're going to see this pattern. People like we saw with projection screens in churches. You know, people are going to find some good ways to use it. We'll probably find a lot of like bad ways to use it. You know what? I think maybe one of like my key things too is that it takes a long time to really learn how to use a technology effectively. And so I think I would say is that, like, I don't even think like churches have sort of fully embraced pre-existing technologies, you know, information technologies. Like, there's a lot of ways we could, you know, kind of automate and streamline, you know, churches. Like, do churches even know how to put together a good website? Like kind of like one of my pet peeves is, you know, sort of like a user experience perspective. Like, what is the number one reason people are ever going to navigate to your church's website for? It's going to be mass times. How many of them have mass times as the first thing listed on there? It's kind of like they don't, you know. And so I'm sure this is the kind of thing, you know, you guys and your company is like very aware of. So like, it doesn't take AI to like learn how to do those things. I don't know, maybe AI tools that will make it easier for people to update their you know, church web pages and things like that. So, you know, potentially maybe they could help. I think maybe more in the back end. I don't think I could see many sort of like I can't imagine many immediate front facing use cases for it. I mean, I think of, I don't know, have you seen it's like a very dystopian film, THX 1139. It's like George Lucas's film that he came up with before Star Wars.
I have not. I think I've heard of it though.
Yeah. There's like it's a dystopian world where you go into this confessional booth and there's just an image of almost sort of like a priest-like character, and it goes, "Go on, tell me." Very well, very well. You know, so it's like, no, we don't need that. We're never going to need that. That's never going to be the answer, I think. So honestly, yeah, maybe parish administration, if you can make it easier for the people who are not as well technologically versed to update their web page to a, you know, better format, maybe that could be a really good use. So.
Yeah, and even sort of an audit tool eventually of, you know, do you have the important components on there? Or even to your point, automation. you know, if the system knows that your visual mask time changes when daylight savings kicks in, that could be an automated little feature. So, and I
Yeah.
think you're right. Like I obviously use software day in and day out, and so many are trying to incorporate these different AI features, but they don't quite fully know how it's going to be used. And so everything's,
Yeah.
you see
Yeah.
beta this and beta that. And sometimes they completely miss the mark. Sometimes you can actually get some use out of it. So
Yeah.
you're right. I feel like we're really
Have you
feeling
ever
this
heard
all
of like
out.
I forget, it's like called the hype curve or something like that? Like
Yes, I know what you're referring to.
any new technology, people get very excited about it and they're expecting immediate payoffs, and they don't find those immediate payoffs, and then everyone gets really unexcited about it, and then it takes a lot longer to actually accumulate those real returns. And we saw this with the invention of the internet, and I think we'll see this with AI as well too. So
Do you have any insights on where things are going with AI? I mean, every time I turn around, it seems like there's a new use for it. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think maybe one of the things I would say is just like, we haven't reached a plateau yet. This is still kind of like the tip of the iceberg. So expect to see newer and more fascinating things. Um, One of the things everybody's talking about is AGI, artificial general intelligence. And this is, it's sort of termed as, it's sort of maybe defined as just like the ultimate general purpose AI that could kind of like do anything for you. It could be like, oh, could you rearrange my, financial books, and poof, it would do it for you automatically. I think maybe the thing to be aware of is that that's not going to be artificial consciousness. The thing I like to point out about consciousness is that we can't even define what consciousness is. Like neuroscientists have a lot of varying definitions and hypotheses and things like that. And so if you can't even say how far away the moon is, how can you even think about getting there? If you can't define consciousness, how do we think we're going to create consciousness? So, so we'll probably come some great things that can sort of like ape consciousness, perhaps. And there will be a lot of fanfare and discussion about like, crazy things like, oh, is this actually a conscious AI kind of a thing? Should we unplug it? And so anyway, that's I think that's a lot of discussion you'll see in the next kind of coming years. Expect to see a lot of interesting things. I think would be my biggest takeaway. This has not plateaued yet.
Yeah, it's certainly an exciting time. And, as I was preparing for this episode with you, I listened to an interview that you did. I think it was with OC Catholic. I think it was back in 2018.
Okay.
So it was a number of years ago, and you guys touched on AI. And at the time it was just,
very nascent.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was interesting listening to that here, 7 years later, and where AI is today. So we have no idea what we might be talking about in 7 years. We might look back on this interview and laugh.
Yeah. That's true.
It definitely it's an interesting time. And, I think what you said earlier is good. We shouldn't necessarily be afraid of new tech in AI, but we should be very thoughtful, as the church always is, in how we apply it and how we use it, and what effects it has on our lives, especially our spiritual lives. And, we're human beings, the community and the social aspects of our lives.
Yeah. I would totally agree.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I do want to go back to Bibles and Brew real quick.
Sure.
If there's a parish or even just a man listening to this that sort of wants to start that, again, we talked about Exodus 90. I think they give some really good guidance in the app as well to get a men's group going naturally. But any other advice or resources that you have for men to start that if they don't feel like they have that in their community right now?
Yeah. So I have a I was throwing shade on the parishes for having out of date websites. I'm going to confess that I have a very out of date website for Bibles and Brew. I think I do have a few articles on there for like just advice on like how to start it or some material. One of the best piece of advice I have comes from G.K. Chesterton. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly. I.e., don't be a perfectionist, just do it. Like, just find a way to do it. Just start doing it. So that would honestly be my best advice. like is like just start doing it. Find guys to meet with, do it regularly, and there's a lot of practicals in there too about like how to structure it for success and whatnot. But yeah, check out the website. Maybe I'll go and see if I can update anything to make sure it's all the links are working. So
awesome, and we'll include a link to that and all the different descriptions of where this audio and video podcast get posted. So
Sure.
Bibles and Brew, and just look for that website. There it is right there, biblesandbrew.com. And maybe we'll have to have a conversation with you after about coming onto the eCatholic platform. That might be a nice easy way to keep things up to date.
Keeping our website up to date. Yeah,
exactly. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. This was an excellent conversation. I really enjoyed the topics we covered, and hopefully we'll have you back soon. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
For sure. Glad you guys brought me to talk. So,
all right. God bless.
Thank you. You too. Take care.